On my wedding night, my husband left me alone in our hotel suite and went to another woman's bed. But what he didn't know was that I was waiting for exactly that. Every step he took that night was inside a trap I had built myself, brick by brick, for months. He thought he had won. The next morning, when he walked back into the room with a smirk on his face, he found the end of the life he knew. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are traveling. I remember the exact moment everything shifted inside me. It wasn't when I found the texts. It wasn't when I saw the photos. It was when he looked me in the eyes on our wedding night and said he was leaving. No guilt, no hesitation, like he was telling me he was going out to grab a coffee at Starbucks. I was 32 years old, a CFO at an international consulting firm, owning a condo in Lincoln Park bought with my own money, and a life built with my own two hands. And yet, there I was, standing in the middle of a luxury suite on the 45th floor of a hotel in downtown Chicago, still in my wedding dress, watching my husband grab his blazer and walk out. His name was Caleb, 34, a sales manager for a mid-sized firm, easy smile, sharp talker. The kind of guy who charms every room he walks into. We met through mutual friends, were together for 2 years, and when he proposed, I believed it was real. I believed he saw me as a partner. I believed we were equals. But I was wrong. And the most painful discovery wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing he never saw me as a woman. He saw me as an opportunity. 6 months before the wedding, I started noticing the signs. He'd jump when his phone buzzed. He typed while shielding the screen. He'd leave to fix things at the office at hours that made no sense. My intuition, sharpened by years of high-stakes negotiations, sounded the alarm within the first few weeks. But I needed certainty before I acted. I've always needed certainty. I hired a private investigation firm. Discreet, professional, expensive. The report arrived in less than 3 weeks, and what was inside turned my blood cold, not with pain, but with cold fury. Caleb was in an active relationship with a woman named Skylar, 22, a student who was essentially living off him. And he was living off me. There was more. While I was away on a business trip in London, he brought this woman to my apartment. He slept in my bed, used my kitchen, had dinner on my balcony. The photos were all there, captured by the surveillance team. I read the entire report sitting at my desk at 11 p.m., holding a glass of water that didn't shake once. When I finished, I closed the folder, went to the window, and looked out at the Chicago skyline for a long time. Anyone else would have called him right then. They would have screamed, cried, thrown things, canceled the wedding, demanded answers. I understand that impulse. It's human. But I'm not driven by impulse. I'm driven by results. And the result I wanted wasn't just to break up with Caleb. I wanted him to feel, in his own skin, what it's like to be destroyed by someone you trust completely. I wanted him to wake up one day with no way out, no money, no reputation, no support from the people he loved, the rug pulled out from under his feet. For that, I needed time, and patience, and a flawless plan. I went through with the wedding. I kept smiling at the engagement parties, the vendor meetings, and dinners with his family. I kept sleeping next to him every night, knowing exactly what he was. It required a level of emotional regulation I'd never had to use before. But I did it because I knew where I was headed. Because I knew, behind the scenes, while I was picking out flowers and menus with him, I was building the trap with the help of 3 people. My older brother Julian, a high-powered attorney specializing in white-collar fraud. My trusted business partner, Dr. Sarah Miller, who handles our family office contracts, and a detective named Marcus, who continued to track Caleb's every move. Because yes, there is a family business. There is the Sterling Group, and I am the sole heiress. I never told Caleb, not because it was a state secret, but because from the start I decided to work under my own name, in my own space, without using the family's prestige as a shield. I wanted to prove to myself I could do it. And I did. But that also meant Caleb, in approaching me, saw only a successful career woman with her own assets. He didn't imagine the true scale of what was behind me. That was the biggest mistake of his life. The wedding night was beautiful. 300 guests, a ballroom on Michigan Avenue, a live band, vintage French champagne. Caleb smiled all night. He danced with me. He gave a moving speech. He looked me in the eyes and told me he loved me in front of everyone. And I smiled back, because I knew every word he said in that moment was being used against him. Because among those 300 guests, there were witnesses I had placed there. There was a notary. There were cameras at angles he never noticed. And there was a woman named Eleanor tucked away at a back table, a woman from Caleb's past I'd discovered weeks earlier, who was there of her own volition to see the conclusion of a story that started long before I entered his life. When we got to the hotel, I was at peace, not from happiness, from certainty. Then he grabbed his coat and told me Skylar was having a crisis, that he needed to go to her, that I was strong, and he knew I'd understand. He called me rational. He called me mature. As if those were compliments, as if that justified everything. I stood still, watching him walk out. When the door clicked shut, I opened my phone, logged into the tracking app that had been on his device for 2 months, and confirmed the address he was heading to. Then I called Julian. "He's out," I said. "We're ready," he replied. I put the phone on the table, poured a glass of champagne, and sat in the armchair facing the window. Below, the city lights blurred into a sea of gold, and I thought, tomorrow morning when he comes back smiling, thinking he's won, he's going to open this door and find the end of everything he knows. I sipped the champagne slowly, and I waited. At 11:42 p.m., I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. I knew who it was before I opened it. Skylar. The message was long, full of typos and emojis, the kind of text someone writes when they're trying to hurt you on purpose. It said Caleb was lying next to her right then, that he had chosen her, that I was too old for him, that she was what he really wanted, and that I should just sign the divorce papers and make it easy for everyone. At the end, she sent a photo. Caleb, arms spread wide on her bed, grinning at the camera. The same grin he'd given me at the altar 3 hours earlier. I took a screenshot. I saved it to the evidence folder, which already had over 200 files. Then I replied with only one thing, a clock emoji. She didn't get it. She didn't need to get it yet. What I was timing wasn't my pain. It was their destruction. While they were celebrating what they thought was a victory, the gears I'd spent months setting were finally in motion. Julian was in the city, in a temporary office we'd rented near the hotel, meeting with 2 lawyers and a forensic accountant. Marcus, the detective, was parked 2 blocks from Skylar's apartment, recording everything. And Dr. Miller was finalizing the last documents to be served the next morning. There was a detail Caleb never knew, and it changed everything. Weeks before the wedding, he asked me to sign a prenuptial agreement. He said it was to protect us both, that it was the right thing to do, that it was about transparency. I agreed. In front of him, I read the document, signed it, and handed it back with a smile. What he didn't see was that before signing, my brother had swapped 2 clauses for others. In the version Caleb kept, there was a clause stating that in the case of divorce, due to proven infidelity by the husband, all assets acquired during the relationship, including the condo I'd bought while we were dating and where he'd lived for 8 months, reverted entirely to me, with additional damages for emotional distress. He signed without rereading, because he trusted me, or rather, because he underestimated me too much to imagine I could play this game. Beyond the contract, there was another layer Caleb was completely blind to. Over the last 3 months, while we were planning the wedding, he'd made strange financial moves using a joint account we'd opened to pay wedding vendors. Small amounts, but frequent. Marcus tracked them all. The money was going to Skylar, disguised as payments to a supposed freelance consultant. It was her name on a business account she'd recently opened. Simple fraud. Amateur. The kind of thing any forensic accountant deconstructs in an afternoon. And we deconstructed it. The report was ready. The bank statements, the invoices, the transfers, all catalogued with a signed technical opinion. The next morning, this would become a formal notification to the bank, a report to the IRS, and part of the legal filing Julian had already submitted that night. While Caleb slept in Skylar's apartment, thinking tomorrow was a celebration, his life was being processed by a system that doesn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Marcus. He's still there. Lights out. Cars in the spot. No movement. Keep monitoring, I said. Copy that. One more thing. The girl has frequent visits from another man over the last 2 months. I have the photos. You want them in the report? I paused. Include everything. I hung up and stared at the ceiling. That info wasn't a total surprise. I'd suspected Skylar wasn't exactly who Caleb thought she was. But knowing she was using him the same way he was using me was an irony I hadn't planned, and it made the play even more precise. Caleb thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He thought he'd built a comfortable life at my expense while keeping what he really wanted on the side. But Skylar was doing to him exactly what he was doing to me. He was just a source of income while she lived another life. He was the villain and the victim at the same time, and he had no idea. I slept for only a few hours, not out of anxiety. It was the light sleep of someone on the eve of a major event who wants to be sharp for every detail. At 7 a.m., I got up, showered, and dressed slowly. I chose something simple, professional, and understated. I ordered breakfast from room service. I sat in the armchair with my coffee and waited. Julian arrived at 7:30 a.m. with the final papers and 2 associates. Caleb's mother, Mrs. Harrison, arrived at 8 a.m. at my request. She didn't know exactly what I'd found, but she knew enough. I'd spoken to her 3 days prior, with respect, showing her just enough to understand the gravity of the situation. She arrived with a grim face and red eyes. She sat on the sofa without a word. And at 8:23 a.m., the suite door opened. Caleb walked in with the smile of a man who'd had a great night and thought he'd find a devastated wife who would accept any excuse. The smile of someone who thinks the game is already won. He saw Julian. He saw the lawyers. He saw his mother on the couch. And the smile vanished. The silence in the room was heavy. Caleb stood in the doorway for a few seconds, looking at everyone as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. I sat in the chair, coffee cup in hand, and said nothing. I let the silence do the work. His mother spoke first. Mrs. Harrison didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at her son and said, in a voice that cut the air like a knife, "You have embarrassed me." 3 words, and Caleb crumbled inside before a single document was shown. Julian got straight to the point. With the objectivity of someone who'd spent years dealing with the worst of human dishonesty, he laid the folders on the table and dissected every layer of what Caleb had done. Not just the affair, but the financial fraud, the disguised transfers, the misuse of the joint account, the expenses for Skylar paid for with our shared money. Caleb tried to talk. He tried to justify it. He said he could explain, that it was a misunderstanding, that the money was for something else, that I'd gotten it wrong. Then Julian placed the prenuptial agreement on the table. The one Caleb had signed. The one with the clauses he hadn't reread. His face turned white. I put my coffee down, stood up slowly, and walked to the table. I opened the contract to the page that mattered and pointed to the clauses. "You asked me to sign this to protect us," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "You signed it without reading. You thought I wasn't paying attention. You thought I was predictable." He opened his mouth. "No," I said before he could speak. "Now you listen." And he listened. Julian presented the documents one by one. The detective's report with photos of every meeting with Skylar, including the ones in my condo. The fraudulent transactions, the notification already sent to the bank, and finally, the lawsuit filed that very morning seeking an annulment based on fraud and damages for emotional and financial distress. Caleb looked like he was going to faint. "This is an exaggeration," he said, finally finding his voice. "This is revenge. It's not fair." I looked at him for a long time. Fair would have been you being honest from the start. Fair would have been you respecting me. What's happening now isn't revenge, Caleb. It's consequences. From the sofa, Mrs. Harrison made a low sound. Not a sob, but the sound of someone holding back a lifetime of disappointment. Caleb tried another tactic. He asked to talk in private. He said we could fix this. He'd pay it back. He said if I dropped the suit, we could work something out. Julian put one more document on the table. It was a statement Caleb had signed weeks earlier authorizing certain moves in the joint account. A statement that, combined with the fraud evidence, moved this from a civil matter to a criminal one. "With this document, we can involve the district attorney," Julian explained coldly. "This moves out of family court and into white-collar crime." Caleb sank into the chair by the window. His legs clearly couldn't hold him anymore. And that was when my phone rang. It was Marcus. I answered without moving. "She's here," he said. "Let her in," I replied. Caleb heard me, but didn't understand. But 2 minutes later, when the door opened again, he understood everything at once. Skylar walked in with the confidence of someone who'd been summoned by Caleb himself. She thought she was there to back him up. She didn't know I'd had Marcus contact her, pretending to be Caleb's assistant, saying he needed her there immediately. When she saw the room full of lawyers, Julian, Mrs. Harrison, and me staring directly at her, she stopped dead. "Sit," I said, pointing to the chair next to Caleb. She didn't sit right away. She looked at Caleb for guidance. And Caleb, for the first time since I'd known him, had no answers to give. She sat. What happened over the next 20 minutes turned Skylar's expression from arrogance to sheer terror. Because Julian, with the same cold objectivity, began presenting the documents related to her, the irregular payments, her shell company's tax ID, the fake invoices, and then, the part she didn't expect, the photos of the other man, the texts between her and this man obtained through Marcus's investigation, proving she was also having a parallel relationship and was using Caleb as a sugar daddy to fund it. Caleb turned to her with an expression I can't fully describe. It was a mix of disbelief, humiliation, and rage. The same mix I felt months ago. Except I didn't show it. He showed it all in front of everyone. Skylar tried to explain. Caleb tried to argue. They started accusing each other at the same time. I let it happen for exactly 2 minutes. Then I stood up and walked to the window. "Enough," I said without turning around. "Both of you are going to sign the documents on this table. Or the next conversation will be with the DA, not with me." The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of people realizing too late that there was no way back. There is a specific moment in a situation like this when the person on the other side realizes they have lost everything. It's not when you show the evidence. It's a subtle moment, almost imperceptible, when something in their eyes just goes out, like a light bulb shattering. I saw that moment in Caleb when Julian put the last document on the table. It was a statement for an account Caleb didn't know I knew existed. An offshore account in Grand Cayman, opened in a friend's name, where he'd been siphoning money from our shared expenses. The plan, according to Marcus, was to build up enough for a down payment on a place Caleb intended to buy in Skylar's name after the wedding. With my money. For her. When Julian read it out loud, I heard Caleb make a low sound, almost inaudible, like someone who'd taken a gut punch and had no air left to scream. Skylar sat in total silence. She realized this wasn't just about Caleb and me. It was about everything they had done, and it was all documented. Mrs. Harrison stood up from the sofa and went to the window. She wasn't crying. She stood with her back to her son, and that posture said more than any words. Caleb tried one last move. He turned to me and said, in a voice trying to sound heartbroken, that I had planned this from the start to destroy him. That it was a setup, that he was manipulated. I looked at him. You weren't manipulated, I said. You made every single decision with total freedom. I just documented them. You met me knowing you'd do this. No, I actually fell in love with you. I paused. And when I found out who you really were, I had to decide what to do with that. I could have walked away then. But you had already caused enough damage to deserve a proportional response. He stayed quiet. Besides, I continued, you completely underestimated who I am. That has a price. That was when Julian opened the final folder, and he placed something on the table Caleb had never seen. The organizational chart for the Sterling Group. Not the public one you find on LinkedIn. The internal one, with the subsidiaries, the hedge funds, the private equity holdings, and at the very top, 2 names. My father, the founder, and below him, as heiress and director of development, Sofia Sterling. Caleb stared at that document for a long time. Then he looked at me. That's Sterling? I am, I said. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of someone realizing he'd spent 2 years trying to rob someone who had enough power to erase him without breaking a sweat. Skylar made a strange sound, a nervous laugh. Then she covered her mouth. Julian explained what the Sterling name meant for this situation. It meant the legal resources available were on a scale Caleb could never fight. It meant the lawsuit wasn't just a scorned wife case. It was a move by a family with decades of legal structure and the patience to see it through to the end, no matter how long it took. I never used my family name to make my career easier, I said. I worked under my own name because I wanted to prove I could do it alone. And I did. But using that name now, to make sure you answer for what you did, that's not just my right. It's the right thing to do. Caleb signed, not because he wanted to, but because Julian made it clear that the alternatives were all much, much worse. Skylar signed too. Her hand was shaking visibly. When the papers were gathered, Mrs. Harrison grabbed her purse, stood in front of her son for a moment, said nothing, and walked out. Caleb watched the door close for a long time. I grabbed my coat and bag. On the way out, I stopped next to him. You called me cold once. You said I was incapable of being light or spontaneous. He didn't answer. You were right, I said. I plan everything. And that's exactly why you're in that chair and I'm walking out that door. And I walked. What comes after the payoff, no one tells you. When I stepped out of the hotel elevator that morning into the windy city sun, I expected to feel something grand, triumph, relief, that movie moment where the music swells. I didn't feel any of that. I felt exhausted. The kind of tired that comes from months of carrying a weight you decided to show no one. The weight of smiling at the wrong time, of holding your tongue, of planning with a precision that required me to set aside every genuine moment of weakness. I got in my car. I told the driver to just drive. We passed through neighborhoods I knew by heart, streets I'd walked with Caleb, the restaurant in River North where he proposed, the park where we spent a rainy Sunday just talking. Those places still existed. They looked the same. But the memory of them was tainted now. That was the hardest part to process. It wasn't regret. I didn't regret a single thing I did. Caleb chose to cheat, chose to defraud, and chose to humiliate me on the most symbolic night of our lives. Every consequence he faced was a result of his own choices. But the pain I felt wasn't about him. It was about the version of me that believed. The one who let down the wall I'd built over years of independence and let in someone who used that opening against me. That hurts differently. It's not just the betrayal, it's the sting of having trusted at all. My phone buzzed. Julian. Everything's set, filings are in, the offshore account is frozen. How are you? I'm fine, I said. Sofia. I'm fine, Julian. He was silent for a moment. He knows me better than anyone. He knew I was lying, but he knew I needed the space. Call me when you want to talk, he said, and hung up. I stayed in the car for another hour. Then I went to the office. Not because I had to, but because work was where I felt most like myself, where the rules made sense, where effort produced results, and where I knew exactly how to lead. When I walked onto my floor, my assistant looked at me, trying to be neutral. "Good morning, Ms. Sterling. Are you sure you want to be here today?" "I am," I said. "Get me a coffee and the quarterly earnings report." I worked for 8 hours straight. It wasn't an escape, it was a choice. That afternoon, I got a message from an unknown number. Regina. I knew who she was. Marcus had found her weeks ago. She was an entrepreneur from New York who had dated Caleb 3 years ago. Like me, she found out too late he was using her for money while seeing someone else. Unlike me, she didn't have the resources to strike back. She'd walked away losing everything she'd invested in him. She was in Chicago and asked to grab a coffee. We met the next day at a cafe in the Gold Coast. She sat with the straight posture of someone who had learned to stay on guard. We evaluated each other in silence, the way two people do when they recognize a shared history that needs no explanation. She told me her story. I listened. Some parts surprised me, not the actions but the details. It was like hearing an earlier draft of the script he'd tried to use on me. "You did what I couldn't," she said. "How?" "I had more time to prepare," I said, "and resources you didn't." "It's not just that." "No," I agreed. "I decided he wasn't getting away with it, and when I decide something, I don't stop." Regina stayed quiet. "There's someone else you should know about," she said. "A woman named Camilla, recent, right before you. She was hurt too. She doesn't know you exist." Camilla was 29, an architect. Caleb had convinced her to invest her life savings into a business he was starting. A total scam. The money vanished along with him. Camilla had tried to sue, but without proof or money for a long legal battle, she'd given up. I contacted her through Julian. She was suspicious at first, but when we showed her the evidence we'd gathered, she went silent. "Do you have proof he took my money?" she asked. We did. Our forensic work had uncovered transactions dating back years. Caleb was sloppy because he never thought anyone would look this closely. Camilla joined the suit. With 3 victims and Julian's evidence, the case moved from a civil dispute to a pattern of fraudulent conduct. It changed the legal weight completely. In the weeks after the wedding, while the law did its work, I kept moving. I had meetings, clients, and decisions. Caleb was a chapter. My life was the book. But one moment caught me off guard. Caleb's mother, Mrs. Harrison, asked to meet. I hesitated, but there was a sobriety in her text that made me say yes. We met for tea. She told me a story about Caleb's father, patterns that repeat when no one has the courage to break them. She wasn't making excuses. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said. "I'm here because you deserve to know I saw the signs and didn't act. That's on me. You saw, you planned, and you acted. I spent 30 years doing nothing. I wanted you to know that what you did, it matters." She handed me an envelope, a handwritten letter. I didn't read it there. When I left, I felt a knot undoing itself. I wasn't alone. Mrs. Harrison had been on my side in silence. Regina had carried a piece of this story. Camilla had tried. Julian had worked through the nights. I had never been alone. That night, on my balcony, I read the letter. It mentioned my mother, who died when I was 11. Mrs. Harrison and my mother had been friends when they were young. She mentioned a promise she'd made to my mother. I felt the first tears of the whole week. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of finally letting go of the weight. 6 months later, the fallout was complete. The civil case resulted in asset seizures. The offshore account was liquidated. The condo reverted to me. The criminal investigation was ongoing. Skylar faced her own legal trouble for the fraudulent company. The man she was seeing left her the moment the heat turned up. She was alone. I didn't obsess over the details. My job was done. I needed to rebuild my inner life. I started small, Waking up without an alarm, no phone for the first 2 hours. Coffee, slowly. Walking with no destination. I visited my father at his lake house. We talked for real, no business. "You're just like your mother," he said. "Not your face, the way you decide. She never made a choice out of fear, only when she was certain." I thought about that. It was true. I didn't plan this out of rage, though I was angry. I planned it because I wanted a result. I wasn't acting out of fear he'd get away. I acted because I decided he wouldn't. I met Regina again. She'd organized an event for women in similar situations, financial fraud in relationships. She asked me to speak. I didn't give details. I talked about what I learned. That documentation has value, that your circle matters, that being cold, analytical, and calculating aren't flaws, they're tools, as long as you know what you're using them for. When I stepped off the stage, Camilla was in the front row. She just nodded. I made a decision that day. With Julian and my father, we started a foundation, a formal support structure for women facing matrimonial fraud, turning a horror story into a resource. Today, a year after that night in the hotel, I wake up in a home that is entirely mine. Not shared, not compromised, mine. It's not lonely, it's free. Caleb doesn't take up space in my head. When you process something fully, it loses its weight. It becomes part of the history, not the center of it. Last week I found Mrs. Harrison's letter in my desk. The last line said, "I hope you find someone who sees you for real, not for what you represent, but for who you are." I don't know what's next, but I'm ready. Not just because of strategy, but because I finally know who I am when I take the armor off. And I like her. If you enjoyed this story, click subscribe. And tell me in the comments, which part left you speechless? Don't forget to become a member for exclusive videos. See you in the next one.